About 7 years ago, during a weekend trip, my wife, Sarah, and our 3 young boys, who were much smaller back then, spent time at the family cabin we had bought just half a year earlier. From the very beginning, we noticed unusual shadows, flickering lights, and movement around the property. That particular evening, everyone went to bed around 10:30, but I stayed behind to sneak a piece of the dessert bars Sarah had baked earlier. As I quietly sliced off a piece in the kitchen, I distinctly heard a woman's voice whisper, "Hey, what are you doing in here?" The sound sent chills down my spine. Thinking it might be Sarah, I called out her name without turning around, but there was no response. When I glanced back, the room was empty. Shrugging it off, I returned to cutting the dessert, only to hear another whisper, even clearer this time. "Hey, are you going to eat that? I want some." Startled, I quickly looked around, but again, no one was there. Feeling uneasy, I hurried to the bedroom and found Sarah wide awake. She hadn't left the room, let alone been in the kitchen. After calming myself, I mustered the courage to return to the kitchen about 10 minutes later to clean up. But thankfully, nothing strange happened this time. However, the following night brought new chills. As I lay in bed on my side, I felt a gentle tug on my sleeve. Turning to see what it was, I heard a faint whisper say, "Mom, Dad." Alarmed, I went to check on the boys across the hall, but they were all fast asleep. I strained to listen and caught faint murmurs, though I couldn't make out the words. That night, I set up a recorder in the kitchen, hoping to capture any strange noises, but I've yet to review the tape. A part of me wonders if there's a logical explanation, like someone speaking into the vent system. But given the cabin's secluded location, on a quiet road surrounded by unoccupied cabins, it seems unlikely anyone would go to such lengths for a prank. On a side note, this reminds me of a story my friend once shared. When he was young, he was staying at his family's cabin. Late one night, a disoriented woman, possibly intoxicated, wandered onto their property. She crept up to the fence in the darkness and began whispering through the slats. My friend woke to the sight of her pale face inches away from the window, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Naturally, it terrified him, as it would anyone in that situation. This is a story my uncle told me. He tied the knot for the first time in his early 40s. For their honeymoon, he, his new wife, and her young daughter, an amazing girl with special needs, went to spend a few days in a cozy cabin near Lake Arrowhead in Southern California. They rented the cabin, unpacked their belongings, and settled in for what was planned as a relaxing 3-day retreat. On the final night of their stay, he stayed up late, watching TV in the living room while his wife and stepdaughter were fast asleep. At one point, he felt the need to use the bathroom, so he got up, took care of business, and stepped back out into the dimly lit cabin. The only light was the soft glow of the television, which illuminated part of the living room and hallway. As he exited the bathroom, he noticed his wife walking down the hall toward the kitchen. Thinking she might be hungry or getting a late-night snack, he followed her. But as she reached the end of the hallway, she suddenly turned toward the kitchen and, in a blink, sprinted at an impossible speed. She was wearing what looked like the long, flowing white nightgown his wife had gone to bed in, and her hair appeared similar, just past shoulder length. Feeling uneasy, he cautiously stepped back and peeked into the bedroom where his wife and stepdaughter were supposed to be. To his shock, both were still sound asleep in bed. Chilled to the bone, he spent the rest of the night wide awake, counting the hours until morning. The following day, as they were preparing to leave, he called the cabin's owner and asked, "Why didn't you tell me this place was haunted?" To his surprise, the owner replied, "Oh, you saw her, huh?" The fact that the owner immediately knew it was a woman without any mention of details confirmed what he feared. There was indeed something otherworldly in that cabin. Reflecting on the experience later, he admitted that if the ghostly figure had turned to face him, he probably would have lost all control in sheer terror. Although the trip wasn't what they expected, it left him with an unforgettable story to tell. I went to a summer camp with a friend, and we stayed in the same cabin. We would stay awake chatting until we got tired and eventually fell asleep. My friend Sam and I sneaked a couple of instant coffee packets from the kitchen one night and mixed them with water to drink. Sam didn't handle caffeine as well as I did, so while the rest of us dozed off, he stayed up. I noticed and asked him what he was up to. He said he had a book and planned to read it until he felt sleepy. Around 1 a.m., the cabin was silent as we all slept when suddenly, the loudest scream jolted everyone awake. Sam was crying and trembling in his sleeping bag. Everyone rushed over to check on him. His scream was so loud that, if it hadn't woken up the other cabins and camp leaders, his sobbing afterwards certainly did. When the staff arrived and crowded into the cabin, I stayed on my bunk to avoid getting squished. Through tears, Sam told us he saw a ghost outside our cabin. He described hearing the sound of air moving as the ghost passed by. Another camper chimed in, saying he also heard that sound. Sam was sent home the next day, but the rest of us stayed at camp, though the atmosphere felt unsettling. Later, when we were back home, Sam shared more about what happened. I found it strange because he's one of the most truthful people I know, and he seemed genuinely shaken by the experience. At first, I wondered if the caffeine caused it, but we'd had coffee the previous night without any odd effects, and Sam regularly drank it for the taste, even though it kept him awake. Sam told me he'd seen the ghost for about 3 seconds. At first, he was frozen in shock. The ghost wasn't like those from movies. It was faint and almost invisible. What startled him most was that the ghost appeared to be a young boy wearing outdated clothes, not a uniform like ours. Sam said he wasn't terrified in that brief moment, just stunned to see something so unreal. But then, as he screamed, the ghost turned its lifeless eyes toward him and rushed out of the cabin, creating the gust-like noise Sam and the other camper heard. I remember vividly how Sam described it. He said the ghost's blank stare lasted only a moment, but it felt like forever. It wasn't a trick of his mind. He was sure of what he saw. The eyes, he said, looked utterly hollow, as if the soul behind them had vanished. The memory haunted him, and I felt terrible for what he went through. To this day, I doubt Sam will ever agree to go camping again. My mom and 2 older brothers would visit my aunt and her 3 kids around the holidays. The entire family, uncles, aunts, everyone would gather together. They lived near a small town in northern Scotland, not far from Inverness, in an area called Blackhaven. Technically, the place was called Stonemire, but Inverness was the better-known nearby city. Blackhaven was rumored to have been a spot where witches gathered on Halloween to perform dark rituals, including animal offerings. Whether any of that was true or just old legends was anyone's guess. Our family decided to meet up at a rented holiday cottage just a short walk from my cousin's house. The cottage had plenty of bedrooms, making it ideal for hosting a group. I shared a room with my older brother and his friend, who was visiting from abroad. They were sound asleep, but I wasn't. I woke up suddenly with no clue why. The room was dim, and the only sounds were their snores. Then, the door creaked open slowly. My heart froze. I didn't see anything come in, but as I strained to make out shapes in the darkness, shadowy forms began to appear. There were 3 of them, faint and shifting, floating near the beds. 2 hovered over my brother and his friend. The 3rd was by my bed. Although it didn't resemble a person except in its vague outline, I felt it watching me. Terrified, I decided the best thing to do was turn toward the wall and force myself to sleep. The next morning, I shared my experience with some family members. Most brushed it off, joking it might have been the witches from the old tales. But one person didn't laugh, my brother's girlfriend. She told me she had felt something strange, too. Sleeping in the next room, she'd woken up in the night, feeling as though someone had sat on the end of her bed. She even felt weight pressing on her legs, though no one was there. Spooked by her story, I decided to check the guest book in the holiday home to see if others had reported anything odd. To my surprise, there wasn't a single mention of strange events. I'll never forget what I saw that night. If you ever find yourself near Black Haven or staying in that same cottage, watch out for shadowy figures creeping into your room after dark. When I was 12 years old, my family and I visited my grandparents, who lived in a cozy cabin deep in the woods near a small pond. The view in the mornings was breathtaking. Since there wasn't any internet and only an old TV from the early 2000s with a few working channels and a VHS player, I brought a friend along for company. My grandmother loved horror movies and had a collection of old tapes. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town and roughly 5 hours from our home. The drive was exciting, and we arrived around 7 p.m. My friend and I were thrilled to be there. As soon as we parked, I jumped out to greet my grandparents, who showed us to the room we'd be sharing upstairs. It was spacious, with a large bed, a small bathroom, and a balcony overlooking the pond. Winter had blanketed the area with snow, and though it was cold, I liked fresh air, so I cracked open the window before heading downstairs to grab our bags. My dad handed over our luggage, and my friend carried hers upstairs. Meanwhile, I sat with my grandmother, who was making hot chocolate. I asked her if we could watch a movie before bed, and she agreed as long as we kept the volume low. After dinner, hot chocolate, and showers, our parents and grandparents went to bed early. My friend and I decided to watch a scary movie from the collection. We picked Friday the 13th and settled in. It was fun, and after the movie ended, we closed the doors and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up at about 8 a.m., eager to eat breakfast and start the day. After eating, we asked if we could explore the forest trail. My grandparents gave us permission but reminded us to stick to the path. My grandmother packed us snacks and sodas, and we set off on the trail after finishing our meal. The walk through the snowy woods was peaceful and slow. After about an hour, we stopped to rest on a large rock and have a snack. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise ahead of us. My friend and I exchanged glances and cautiously walked toward the sound. Soon, we spotted blood on the snow. I thought it might be from a wild animal like a fox catching a rabbit, so we kept going. Then, we heard a girl's voice calling for help. It echoed faintly, "Hello? Is someone there?" My friend hesitated, saying it might be dangerous, but I insisted we couldn't just leave someone who might be lost. We continued walking, calling back, "Where are you?" Like the curious kids we were. The voice repeated, and we followed it, but I tripped over a rock and fell, making my friend laugh. When I stood up, we noticed an old, abandoned cabin ahead. We decided to check it out. Inside, the place was a mess. Discarded shoes, clothes, and spoiled food lay scattered. The air was thick with the smell of rot. We ventured further in and found a room that gave us chills. Chains were attached to the walls, and a bed with restraints stood in the center. Dried blood stained the floor and walls. Horrified, we turned to leave, only to see a girl standing in the doorway, whispering, "Help me." Terrified, we bolted out of the cabin, running back to the trail without stopping. We didn't tell our parents or grandparents about what we saw, afraid we'd get in trouble for wandering off. Back at the cabin, we distracted ourselves with movies until night fell. That night, we were exhausted and went to bed early. I was startled awake by a scream and saw my friend standing near the balcony door. I asked her why she screamed, worried my parents might get angry, but she said it wasn't her. It was the same girl from earlier, standing by the pond with other girls, all yelling for help. Panicked, I shut the balcony door. Moments later, my dad and mom came into the room, asking why we were crying. We explained what we had seen, and my grandmother joined us, saying there couldn't have been anyone outside since she and my grandfather had been sitting on the porch and heard nothing. My friend insisted, telling them about the cabin we found. My dad asked where it was, and we described the location. My grandmother's face turned pale. She sat us down and explained that years ago, a man had been caught for abducting girls and doing terrible things to them in an old cabin nearby. While he was arrested and imprisoned, the bodies of his victims were never found. To this day, I can't forget those girls. I wonder if they were spirits, still waiting for someone to find them and bring them peace. No one should endure such a fate. Did your town ever have any stories like the one about the old abandoned house in the forest? Or the lonely road where people claim to see strange figures? Mine had one, the tale of a deserted cabin in the woods. Growing up, the story circulated that just a short distance south of the town's old library, there was a secluded cabin that had been abandoned for decades. The rumors said something terrible had happened there, gruesome events that left it deserted. The mystery, of course, was how anyone could know about the events if no one had returned to the cabin since. But for us kids, that just added to its allure. One summer day, while hanging out with my friends and suffering from the boredom of small-town life, the cabin popped into my head. Our town, with fewer than 200 residents, didn't have much in the way of entertainment, especially in the days before smartphones. We decided to go find this legendary place. We packed what we thought we'd need, full of excitement. But by the time we were ready, the sun had set, and we realized we'd have to wait until morning. Early the next day, we met behind the library and began our adventure. There was a faint trail at first, maybe once used for something but now overgrown. It led to a small clearing, then disappeared entirely. We decided to head straight south as best we could to avoid getting lost. One of my friends, a cautious type, started marking trees with chalk as we went. While a good idea in theory, there were so many trees that I doubted it would help much. After walking for nearly 3 hours, far longer than the 1 hour south we'd heard, the mood grew grim. Frustration and doubt began to set in until one of us spotted what seemed like a faint path. It was barely there, but the rocks and slight clearing gave it away. Following the path for about 20 minutes, we finally stumbled upon the cabin. Excitement rushed over us as we stood before the decaying structure from the old legend. It was real. The boarded-up cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We circled the building looking for a way in. Every door and window was sealed shut except for one small, loose window. It was just big enough for our thinnest friend, Sam, to squeeze through. With some effort, he climbed inside, and after a bit of teamwork, we managed to open a side window for the rest of us. The interior of the cabin was frozen in time. There were dishes still sitting in the sink, covered in layers of grime. Shoes were scattered on the floor, and faded decorations clung to the walls. It was eerie and fascinating. What intrigued us most was the upstairs. Cautiously, Sam tested the creaking stairs, step by step, to ensure they could hold our weight. One by one, we followed. The second floor had only 2 rooms, both untouched for years. Dust-covered furniture, moth-eaten clothes, and forgotten belongings filled the spaces. While poking around, I noticed something glinting under a bed. Curious, I bent down and found a strange metallic object with faded markings. As I picked it up, I distinctly heard a woman's voice whisper, "Leave now." The voice sent chills down my spine. None of my friends had heard it. There were no girls with us. I put the object back and quietly made my way downstairs, shaken. The others continued exploring until they, too, lost interest. We decided to leave the cabin as we found it, securing the loose boards as best we could. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder at the cabin. From the upstairs window of the room where I'd heard the voice, I thought I saw a pale face staring at me before vanishing. I didn't tell my friends about it. They hadn't seen anything unusual, and I didn't want to spook them. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw or heard. Was it my imagination? A lingering ghost? I'm still skeptical, but the memory haunts me. Years later, during a bachelor party for my brother, I found myself telling the story, still wondering what really happened that summer. That happened during a camping trip where a group of my friends had rented a small cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a 3-day stay. On the first night, I noticed something strange in the room my cousin and I were sharing. As soon as we got into bed, the ceiling began making loud creaking noises. It sounded like someone walking back and forth above us. I brushed it off, thinking it could be the wood contracting from the cold or maybe some animals moving around on the roof, and went to sleep. By the third night, however, it was clear that this wasn't something that could be easily explained. That evening, I went to bed earlier than everyone else, as they were still up chatting and playing cards. The creaking started again right on cue. As usual, I tried to ignore it, but then one of the decorative brass tiles on the wall began to rattle and scrape against the wood. I couldn't come up with any logical explanation for that. It wasn't just the usual creaks from temperature changes or any other ordinary reason I could think of. Still, I was exhausted, so I rolled over and tried my best to ignore it. That's when I felt something grab my arm. I quietly muttered, "Nope," deciding I wasn't going to entertain any restless spirit that night. A moment later, I distinctly heard the ceiling in the room down the hall begin creaking again. This happened when I was around 10 years old. I used to go to a summer camp in a forested area in northern Ontario. The camp had a routine. One week we'd stay in cabins and participate in activities, and the next week we'd go on a canoe trip. I always slept on the top bunk in the corner of a cabin with 5 bunk beds, all occupied. The counselor's bed was behind a curtain at one side of the room. One night, probably around 1 to 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. I glanced over and saw a hunched figure standing in the middle of the cabin, silhouetted by the moonlight streaming in. It was about 5 feet tall, with a sharp, pointed face, elongated fingers, and oddly shaped feet. It reminded me of a goblin. The creature moved slowly, sniffing around each child sleeping in the lower bunks. I was completely frozen, unable to make a sound. I don't think it realized there were kids on the upper bunks, as it didn't seem to look up. After some time, it quietly walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. As it left, it knocked over a metal barrel near the fire pit. Moments later, I heard the counselors shouting something about the barrel, seemingly unaware of what had just happened. That's when it hit me. The counselor in our cabin had been in their bed the whole time. To this day, now in my late 30s, I still wonder what that thing was. It seemed like it was searching for a child who was awake. But why, I have no idea. There are old stories about strange creatures and missing children in the area, and I can't help but wonder if those legends are connected. Needless to say, I never returned to that camp. I've always been open to the supernatural. I've seen ghosts before, but this experience still baffles me. Any thoughts or ideas about what that creature could have been? out hiking with a group of friends on some trails near Dahlonega, Georgia. Out of curiosity, we decided to leave the main path and follow some animal trails to see what we might stumble upon. After about an hour, we figured it was time to head back, but we had taken so many twists and turns that we realized we were lost. We tried to navigate in the general direction of the main trail, and that's when we came across a small clearing with an old crumbling shack. Being young and curious, we decided to check it out. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges and actually came off completely when we pushed it open. The floorboards were so rotted that parts of them gave way under our feet as we walked inside. The interior was eerie. A filthy, mold-covered mattress sat in one corner, practically falling apart. Scattered throughout the place were random dishes and what looked like a very old, rusted radio in one of the rooms. In the back, we came across the skeleton of what we guessed had been a dog or maybe a coyote, completely decomposed. After poking around for a bit, we decided we needed to find the main trail before it got dark so we could set up camp without getting more lost. Since then, we've gone back about 5 times, but strangely, we've never been able to find that cabin again. I never wanted to go in the first place. Let me take you back about 4 years. My partner had this grand idea to rent a small cabin deep in the forest. Camping under the stars wasn't an option, too exposed to the elements. But a wooden cabin? That seemed manageable to her. After weeks of her convincing me about how wonderful it would be, I finally gave in. This was supposed to be an unforgettable getaway in a rustic cabin. It took weeks to plan, but we eventually got everything packed and loaded into the car. The cabin was far, about a 3-hour drive, followed by an hour and a half on a rough trail through the woods. Honestly, she chose this place because of the photos she'd seen online. When we finally arrived, we were sorely disappointed. What was once a picturesque retreat had clearly been neglected for years. It was run down and didn't match the images she'd shown me. We were both tired and frustrated from the long trip. But since we'd already paid for 2 nights, we decided to make the best of it and stay. That's when we discovered something else, something worse. The bed. The sheets looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. Sure, the cabin being old was one thing, but being dirty was unacceptable. And to top it off, there was no cell service. Frustrated, we pulled the sheets off and slept directly on the mattress. It was an uncomfortable night, not just because of the situation, but also because of the sounds. While I was tossing and turning, I started hearing noises. It sounded like something or someone moving above us. The cabin's roof had a small loft-like space, but it didn't seem connected to the living area. We had brought a flashlight, so I decided to investigate. My partner stayed in bed, too scared to look. I searched for some kind of hatch or opening but found nothing. The noises continued, but we decided to ignore them and try to sleep. The next morning, we got ready and went on a hike. One of the activities my partner had promised would be worth the trip. The trail was beautiful, and despite the poor sleep, we had a great time outdoors. We spent nearly 6 hours walking and exploring before returning to the cabin. When we got back, tired but in good spirits, our mood quickly soured. Our food, what little we had brought, had been tampered with. We'd left it neatly stored in a corner of the small kitchen and locked the cabin before heading out, as the owner had suggested to keep wildlife out. But this wasn't the work of an animal. Whoever did it had carefully opened food packages and taken only a small portion. 3 granola bars were missing. The rest of the box was untouched, but the missing bars didn't go unnoticed. We were freaked out. Someone had been in the cabin while we were gone. I couldn't shake the thought of the noises from the night before. Could someone be living in the cabin without us knowing? We spoke in hushed tones, feeling as if we were being watched. The cabin was remote, and there was no way to call for help without driving to find cell service. We decided to leave as quickly as possible. While packing, we discovered something else missing: my wallet. Now I was furious. Someone had not only taken our food, but also my wallet. I decided to confront whoever was responsible. We searched outside the cabin and found a small, hidden hatch near the back. It was slightly ajar, held open by a stick. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the flashlight and opened it. Inside, crouched in the shadows, was a small, rat-like man. The beam of the flashlight startled him, and he let out a squeaky noise. I shouted at him to throw down my wallet. I didn't care about the cash. I just wanted it back. To my surprise, he tossed it toward me. Felt filthy, but I grabbed it and quickly backed away. We didn't waste a second. We threw our things into the car and sped off. Once we reached an area with cell service, we called the cabin owner. He apologized profusely and promised to notify the authorities. We didn't ask for a refund. We just wanted to forget the entire experience. To this day, the thought of that man living above us gives me chills. What really haunts me, though, is how he got in when the door was locked. I had recently moved into the old cabin my great-uncle left me after he passed. It was tucked away in the woods, far from the city, and seemed like the perfect place to start fresh after wrapping up my latest job. On my second night there, I had a vivid dream. In it, all my scars were gone, and I was happily married to my high school love, the life I'd once dreamed of. In the dream, we even had a pet, a lynx of all things. When I woke up that morning, I stepped outside and saw a lynx in the trees, but something about it was wrong. The shadow wasn't its own. It was massive, towering twice my height, with two human-like hands and a head shaped like a triangle. The following night, I dreamed again. This time, my mom had made her signature dish, bell peppers stuffed with tofu and mushrooms. I ate them while sitting on the couch, watching old sci-fi movies with the lynx curled up in my lap. It felt so real, but when I woke up and saw the lynx again in the forest, something in me snapped. I shouted at it, "I see through you." I realized it had been trying to deceive me. The only thing in the dream that felt genuine was my mother. That night brought a nightmare, less vivid but disturbingly clear. People I cared about attacked me over and over. I refused to retaliate and didn't let the lynx interfere either. The next dream was stranger still. The forest itself turned on me. Trees crushed the cabin, and my family vanished before my eyes. For the first time, the lynx spoke to me. "You will be my voice, my echo. This is already decided. I can bring blessings to you and your family or lay curses on your descendants. The choice is yours." We sat in silence, staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I woke to my friend shaking me, frantic. They told me I'd been asleep for nearly 3 days. The dreams didn't stop. They swung between visions of a perfect life and horrifying nightmares, as though something was fighting to claim my mind. One day, while hunting geese, I stumbled across the lynx again. It didn't run, but instead followed me through the woods. I knew the area well. I'd hunted here for years, but that day, I kept getting turned around. Frustrated, I decided enough was enough. I raised my rifle and shot it point blank. The lynx's body seemed to collapse in on itself, crumbling apart until there was almost nothing left, just a scrap of skin dangling from its chest. It didn't move or react. After that, the strange dreams stopped completely. One time, the drive home was unusually quiet. He was 19 then, and it had been years since he'd last gone camping. Honestly, it took me a long while to feel at ease in the woods again. What used to feel serene now felt full of hidden threats. The thought of something or someone unexpected showing up at my tent is a constant worry. I don't hike alone anymore, thanks to this. It gives me chills to think about how close I may have been to something dangerous. Back then, I was dating a guy named Adam. We'd been together for around 8 months, and we enjoyed outdoor dates. Hiking, kayaking, and the like. One Saturday, we decided to explore a state park neither of us had been to before, about an hour outside the city. We got a late start that morning and didn't arrive until almost noon. The weather was perfect. We stopped at the visitor center to grab a map, and the ranger there recommended a 6-mile loop that led to a waterfall overlook. Adam and I geared up with boots and water bottles and set off. The trail was wide and clearly marked at first, winding gently uphill. After about an hour, we reached a fork that wasn't on the map. We debated which way to go, and Adam suggested taking the left path since we could faintly hear running water from that direction, likely the waterfall. As we walked, the trail narrowed and became harder to follow. Dense bushes closed in, blocking the view. About 25 minutes later, I started to feel uneasy and told Adam I thought we should turn back. He dismissed my concerns, saying, "Just a bit further, and we'll find something cool, even if it's not the waterfall." The forest grew thicker, and suddenly, when we emerged into a small clearing, Adam was gone. I called his name, but there was no answer. I backtracked, growing more worried when I didn't find him. How had he disappeared so fast? Up ahead, the trail split again, and neither path looked familiar. I picked a direction at random, hoping to return to the main trail, but everything looked unfamiliar. That's when fear really set in. It hit me I was lost, alone. The sun was beginning to dip lower through the trees, and panic started creeping in. I sped up, looking for any sign of a trail marker or anything recognizable. Strange sounds began echoing in the woods, noises I tried to dismiss. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, crunching leaves, but when I stopped to listen, they stopped too. Exhausted and out of water, I sat on a fallen log, close to tears. That's when I heard a twig snap. My head shot up and I scanned the forest. About 100 feet away stood a man, motionless in the shadows. "Adam?" I called out, but immediately regretted it. The figure was too tall and broad to be him. Why wasn't he responding? Terror surged through me. I grabbed the largest stick I could find and yelled, "Stay back!" The man didn't move. He just stood there, blending with the trees. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I bolted. Every few steps, I glanced back, but the man seemed to have vanished. My lungs burned as I ran until I collapsed in another clearing. By then, the forest was growing darker, and I knew I couldn't wander aimlessly anymore. I had to come up with a plan. I decided to listen for the faint sound of traffic I thought I'd heard earlier. If I could follow it, maybe I'd reach a road or civilization. As I walked quickly toward the noise, every snap of a twig made my heart race. Was that man following me? What did he want? Suddenly, the sound of traffic grew louder. Hope rose in me as I hurried toward it. But then, from behind a tree just ahead, the man stepped into my path. I screamed, my stick raised. He was closer now, and in the dim light, I saw his face. It was badly scarred, with twisted, shiny skin and stringy hair. His one good eye was locked on me. He grinned, his voice gravelly as he said, "Why rush? Stay a while." Every instinct screamed at me to run. I swung the stick, and he dodged, lunging toward me. I took off, weaving through the trees, his heavy footsteps crashing behind me. Finally, I burst out of the woods into a parking lot. Cars lined the lot, and the sound of the highway was unmistakable. Relief flooded me as I ran to a family loading their car. Breathless, I tried to explain what happened. The father and son looked toward the forest as they helped me into their car, locking the doors. Soon, police arrived. One officer went into the woods while another took my statement. The man was nowhere to be found. Back at the station, I learned I'd wandered over 8 miles from the main trailhead. Adam had also gotten lost and was waiting at the park's entrance. When we reunited, he apologized for insisting on continuing down the wrong path. Even now, that man's disfigured face haunts me. I'll never know if he was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know one thing, I'll never hike alone again. This unsettling experience happened a few years back. It was a mild autumn evening, and I was 17 years old, riding my small 150 cubic centimeters motorbike through a quiet countryside town. I had gone out for a late-night ride to clear my mind, as life had been challenging, and the steady hum of the bike's engine always helped soothe my nerves. The ride was serene, just what I needed, calm and uneventful. My route led me to a desolate road that ended near an abandoned farmhouse, where I planned to turn around and head home. Halfway down the stretch, I noticed someone ahead, dressed completely in pale clothing, slowly walking along the roadside. Under normal circumstances, seeing a pedestrian wouldn't have been unusual, but it was nearing midnight, pitch black, and there were no homes or streetlights anywhere along this 3-mile route. Struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. As I approached, I instinctively slowed down. After all, pedestrians can be unpredictable. That was my mistake. As I drew closer, passing them, they suddenly let out a piercing, guttural scream, the most chilling sound I had ever heard. My heart raced, and before I could process what was happening, the figure lunged toward me. I panicked and fumbled to shift into a lower gear, my bike roaring in protest as I pushed it to accelerate. I glanced in my side mirror and saw them running after me. Their speed was unnerving, too fast for a human on foot. The adrenaline kicked in as I gripped the throttle and pushed the bike as hard as it could go. Unfortunately, my bike wasn't built for speed, especially with its modified gears to save fuel. Then I felt it. A hand slapped against the rear of my bike, hard enough to send a jolt of fear through my body. I didn't dare look back. Desperate, I kept the throttle wide open, revving the engine far beyond its normal limit. It wasn't until I hit 30 miles per hour that the figure began to fall behind. But I didn't stop. The realization dawned on me. I was heading straight for the dead end. Panic surged through me as I remembered a narrow dirt path leading into the woods at the road's end. Without hesitation, I veered onto the trail. My bike's older design allowed me to shut off the headlights, so I killed the lights and coasted down the path in near silence, shifting to a higher gear to muffle the engine's sound. The trail eventually led me back to a paved road. I sped down it, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure emerge from the darkness. Only when I reached my garage did I allow myself to breathe. I was drenched in sweat, trembling as I hurriedly parked my bike and locked the door behind me. The next day, I called a close friend and recounted everything. Curious and skeptical, he joined me as we returned to the area. We hiked along the forest trail, searching for any sign of what or who I had encountered, but we found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone had been there besides us. I'm not easily scared, and at 6 feet 1 inch with an athletic build, I don't back down from most challenges. But the scream, that inhuman, blood-curdling sound is something I'll never forget. Even now, thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. I've told a few friends about this, and most believe me, knowing I don't exaggerate or invent stories. That night was the most terrifying experience I've ever had on my bike. Looking back, I suppose I could have tried to defend myself. I was wearing heavy motorcycle gear, but in that moment, my instincts screamed one thing: run. I haven't returned to that road since, and I have no intention of ever going back. I still don't know who or what I encountered that night. The lack of light, the eerie white clothing, the unnatural speed. It all defies explanation. There aren't any hospitals or asylums nearby, so I can't even chalk it up to an escaped patient. Whatever it was, I hope our paths never cross again. Everything changed during the summer before I started high school. With school on break, I had long days to myself while my parents worked. It didn't take long before boredom set in. My grandparents lived about 2 miles away, just beyond the forest, so I decided to hike there a few afternoons for a change of scenery, and to snack on the cookies my grandma always kept stocked. The first few hikes to their house were calm and uneventful. Their cozy home sat right at the edge of the woods, so I would step out of the trees directly into their backyard. Grandma would always greet me with a warm smile and rush to fix me something to eat while I sprawled on the couch, watching TV. This routine quickly became the highlight of those early summer weeks. The walk through the forest was peaceful, just me and the sound of rustling leaves and chirping birds. But toward the end of June, something began to feel wrong. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of animals, felt unnaturally quiet. Even the sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination or a storm brewing in the distance. One afternoon, as I made my way through the woods, I noticed the wind picking up. Dark clouds rolled in, casting an eerie shadow over the trail. By the time the first raindrops hit, I was about halfway to my grandparents' house. I pulled up my hood and pressed on, determined to beat the storm. Thunder rumbled loudly overhead, and the sky took on a sickly green hue. The rain quickly turned into a downpour, soaking me to the bone. The muddy ground made every step a struggle, but I was desperate to reach the warmth of my grandparents' house. Then, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling shriek pierced through the rain. It was like nothing I had ever heard, neither animal nor human. I froze, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a faint, flickering light weaving between the trees. My first thought was that my grandfather had come out with a lantern to look for me, but the shape of the figure carrying it didn't match his tall frame. I called out, my voice barely rising above the storm, but there was no response. Instead, the shriek sounded again, closer this time. The light wavered unnaturally, its movements jerky and uneven. Fear surged through me, and I turned to run, heading deeper into the woods. I didn't care that I was veering off the familiar path. I just needed to get away. The rain made everything harder. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the muddy ground caused me to stumble repeatedly. At one point, a bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree, sending me sprawling to the ground. The acrid smell of charred wood filled the air as smoke hissed against the rain. My heart pounded as I struggled to my feet, hearing the shrieking thing still pursuing me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Finally, I burst into a clearing and spotted an old, abandoned cabin. Without thinking, I threw myself at the weathered door, slamming it shut behind me. Inside, the darkness was absolute, but it felt like a haven compared to what was outside. The creature's cries echoed from the tree line, but it didn't come any closer. Exhausted and trembling, I slid to the floor and must have passed out. When I woke, it was still pitch black, but the storm had lessened to a gentle drizzle. I cautiously stepped outside, my legs shaky but ready to move. The moon peeked through thinning clouds, casting enough light for me to navigate. I spent hours stumbling through the forest, terrified that the thing might still be lurking in the shadows. By some miracle, I found my way out just as dawn broke. When I reached my back porch, I collapsed in relief, too overwhelmed to even take off my muddy shoes. To this day, I haven't told anyone about that night. Whatever I encountered in those woods, I never want to face it again. Misadventure camping used to be one of my favorite family pastimes. The charm of the outdoors, cooking on a fire, and sharing tales under the night sky. It was hard not to love. My wife, Clara, and I took our son, Max, on camping trips every chance we got. But everything changed after that weekend at Pine Ridge Reserve when Max was 12. I doubt I'll ever feel the same about camping again. It was mid-October, the perfect season for camping before the frost arrived. We drove to one of our favorite spots, Hilltop Park, late on a Friday afternoon. Our campsite was tucked away in a quieter area of the reserve, surrounded by towering oaks and pines. After setting up the tent and lighting a campfire, we grilled sausages for dinner. Max was thrilled as the sun set, and I entertained him with spooky stories about the forest. At that age, he found the tales thrilling rather than terrifying. When the fire died down, we crawled into our sleeping bags, exhausted from the drive and setup. The first night outdoors is always magical, so serene and quiet. Wrapped in the tent, the exhaustion overtook us, and we slept deeply. The next morning, we made flapjacks over the fire for breakfast. While we ate, a ranger stopped by to greet us. He was a wiry, older man with a salt and pepper mustache. After a bit of casual chat, he advised us to secure all our food properly, as there had been recent bear activity. We assured him we had a sturdy bear-proof container that we always used. After breakfast, we went on a long hike. Clara, an avid birdwatcher, carried her binoculars and guidebook, identifying finches, sparrows, and even a woodpecker. Max, though initially bored, seemed to enjoy himself by the end of it. In the late afternoon, we returned to the site, played cards, and read books until twilight. That's when I noticed a man at the campsite across from ours. He looked rugged, perhaps in his late 30s or 40s, with an unkempt beard and a faded cap. He nursed a can of beer and poked at his fire absent-mindedly, glancing in our direction repeatedly. Something about his presence unsettled me. As the evening deepened, I made sure Max was inside the tent, out of view. Clara and I sat by the fire until late, chatting and watching the stars before we finally turned in for the night. Some hours later, I woke suddenly to the sound of rustling outside the tent. Twigs snapped, and dry leaves crunched. My heart raced as I strained to identify the noise. Clara and Max were still asleep beside me. The shuffling grew louder, circling the tent. My mind raced. An animal? A thief? Or worse, the strange man from earlier? Slowly and quietly, I reached for the flashlight near my head. Flicking it on, I scanned the inside of the tent. Nothing. The sounds continued just outside. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent flaps slightly and peeked out. The beam of light fell on the man from the other campsite, crouched only a few feet away, his back to me. The moment the light hit him, he spun around, his eyes wild and unfocused. He bared his teeth like a feral animal and lunged. I tumbled backward, shouting for Clara and Max to wake up. Clara sprang into action, grabbing Max and pushing past me as I tried to block the intruder. The man forced his way into the tent, and I kicked at him, my heel striking his face. He howled in pain, and I scrambled out after my family. I grabbed a pocket knife and my car keys from the ground as the man tore through the tent fabric to get out. He charged at me again, blood trickling from his lip, but I dodged and bolted after Clara and Max, who were running toward the main campground. We yelled for help, and soon other campers emerged. I pointed to the woods where the man had vanished. The campground host called emergency services, and other campers searched the area, but the man had disappeared into the dense forest. Paramedics arrived alongside park rangers and police. After giving our statements, we decided to pack up and leave, heading to a nearby motel. That night, none of us slept well. The next morning, we returned home, physically and emotionally drained. The sense of safety I had always associated with camping was shattered. Max no longer asks about camping trips, and Clara and I have avoided discussing that night. For me, the forest will never again feel like a place of peace. A terrifying encounter. I was 16 when this happened. The night sky was illuminated by a bright full moon, casting an eerie glow over the thick woods as I hiked with my two friends, Matt and Lily. At first, it was a crisp autumn evening, beautiful and serene. But once the sun fully dipped below the horizon, the forest took on a sinister air. A creeping dread began to settle over us. Seeing my friends visibly uneasy, I laughed nervously. "Come on, guys. It's just darkness and maybe some distant animals. What's there to fear?" Matt, always the thrill seeker, had been the one to suggest this nighttime hike, calling it an adventure we'd never forget. But as shadows stretched and the forest seemed to close in, I began regretting my decision. Lily, who had been uncharacteristically silent since we entered the woods, finally spoke up. "I don't like this. It's too quiet here. I've heard strange things happen in these woods on full moon nights." I had heard the rumors too. Pets vanishing, odd figures spotted, eerie sounds, but had dismissed them as folklore. Still, as we ventured deeper, I couldn't shake a gnawing unease. "Relax, Lily," Matt said with a grin, throwing an arm over her shoulder. "You've just been listening to too many scary stories. Besides, Alex here will protect us, right?" Forcing a grin, I nodded. "Of course, nothing's going to happen." The crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. Moonlight trickled through the canopy, casting eerie shadows that danced along the forest floor. As we continued, we stumbled upon a concealed trail, hidden behind dense thickets and fallen branches. Matt's eyes lit up. "Hey, look at this. It might be a shortcut. Let's take it." Lily and I exchanged hesitant glances but followed as Matt began clearing the brush with a small pocket knife. The farther we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their tangled branches blocking out the stars and moonlight. "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked nervously. Matt hesitated but then nodded. "It has to lead somewhere. Let's keep going." As we pressed on, strange marks appeared on the trees, deep, claw-like gouges that seemed freshly made. I pointed them out. "Probably just a bear," Matt muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. "Bears? Here," Lily whispered, her face pale. "They usually avoid people," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I felt anything but. The marks grew more frequent as we trudged forward, and a chilling sensation crept over me. We should have turned back long ago. Eventually, we emerged into a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling cabin, its roof partially caved in and windows shattered. "Who would build something way out here?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Matt, undeterred by the cabin's foreboding presence, insisted we investigate. "Come on, let's check it out. Maybe there's something interesting inside." The creaky door groaned as we pushed it open, revealing an interior coated in dust and cobwebs. It was clear no one had been here in ages. As we explored, I noticed strange scratches etched into the wooden walls. "Guys, look at this," I said, pointing to the marks. Matt examined them closely. "These don't look like animal marks. They're too precise, almost human." A chill ran down my spine. Someone or something had been here. As we turned to leave, a deep, guttural growl echoed from outside. We froze. "What was that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "No idea," I murmured, heart racing. Matt cautiously peeked outside. "I don't see anything, but we need to go. Now." We stepped outside, and the growling grew louder. The air was thick with menace. Then, without warning, a massive shape burst from the underbrush. A hulking creature with matted fur and glowing eyes. The thing resembled the werewolves I'd seen in movies. "Run!" Matt yelled. We sprinted, adrenaline surging as the creature charged after us. Its thundering steps and guttural snarls echoed in my ears. I glanced back once and instantly regretted it. The beast's yellow eyes locked onto mine, its elongated snout revealing rows of sharp teeth. Just as I thought it would catch us, the forest thinned, and we stumbled onto the main trail. The creature halted at the edge of the path, its enraged howl echoing through the trees. It didn't follow us further. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Breathless, we burst into nervous laughter, more from relief than humor. As we sped away, I glanced back at the forest, now bathed in moonlight. I'll never forget those glowing eyes or the sheer terror of that night. We agreed never to speak of it. But even now, I wonder what was that thing and why did it let us go? The events of that evening still linger in my mind. Whatever I encountered, it seemed oddly at ease navigating the trees. Even now, whenever I venture into the woods, I find myself scanning the canopy. Over the years, I've intermittently searched for answers, but nothing I've come across quite matches what I saw. This might not be the most terrifying tale, but it's undoubtedly one of the more peculiar ones I've experienced. It happened in the summer of 2021. Fresh out of graduate school and eager for a small adventure before diving into my new job, I planned a week-long solo backpacking trip in Vermont's Green Mountains. As someone familiar with outdoor living, having spent much of my childhood exploring the Adirondacks, I wasn't too concerned about venturing out alone. The first few days were blissful. The weather was just right, warm without being oppressive. I hiked 8 to 12 miles daily, relishing the serene landscapes and occasional encounters with fellow trekkers. For the most part, though, I had the trails to myself. By the third day, the atmosphere began to shift. The vibrant chatter of birds and the rustling of small animals grew faint. The few hikers I crossed paths with responded to my greetings with distant, uneasy glances. Some appeared eager to leave the area altogether. While it unnerved me slightly, I chalked it up to being deeper in the wilderness. That night, I camped near a gentle stream, enjoying the soothing sound of water. The air was still warm, so I left my tent flap partially open to catch a breeze. As I drifted off, faint crunching noises outside stirred me. I sat up, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond the typical night sounds of the forest. Still, sleep didn't come easily after that. The following day, my hike led me out of the valley, up steeper terrain where the forest grew denser. A nagging sensation of being watched settled over me, though no one appeared to be nearby. Brushing it off as unease from prolonged solitude, I pressed on. By nightfall, I found a ridge with a clearing to set up camp. The view of the peaks around me was stunning. After dinner, I tidied up and settled into my tent. A nearly full moon illuminated the tent's interior, casting eerie shadows. I was exhausted, and despite the unsettling atmosphere, I eventually drifted off. Sometime later, I was jolted awake. My tent shook violently, the poles bending under sudden pressure. Panicked, I fought my way out, convinced a bear was attacking. To my surprise, nothing was outside. While the poles were bent and twisted, the tent fabric remained intact. The moonlit forest was eerily silent. Disturbed, I patched up the tent as best I could and spent the rest of the night in restless vigilance. The next morning, I hastily packed up and moved on. The once warm weather had shifted, leaving the air crisp and heavy with moisture. Dark clouds loomed as I descended. Thunder rumbled in the distance, pushing me to quicken my pace. I barely reached a wooden shelter before a downpour unleashed. Relief washed over me as I entered the lean-to, but it was short-lived. Inside, the shelter was in disarray. Dirty, tattered fabric scattered the floor, and the walls bore deep gouges and strange handprints. In the fire pit, bones and charred remains gave off a sickening stench. Backing out, my pulse raced. Then I saw it, a massive shadow moving through the trees. Without hesitation, I ran into the storm, rain blinding me as I stumbled down the trail. Thunder boomed overhead, and the shadow crashed through the underbrush behind me. In a rocky clearing, lightning struck nearby, its deafening crack halting me. When I turned, the woods were silent again, the storm's fury momentarily subdued. Shaken, I found a small crevice in the rocks to shelter in until the rain let up. When I emerged, the sun was setting. Fear gnawed at me as I trudged on, flinching at every sound. In the dense forest, the feeling of being watched returned. My pace quickened. Dusk deepened, casting the trail into shadow. Rounding a bend, I collided with something, soft but solid. Reeling back, I looked up and froze. A ghastly, pale face with hollow black eyes stared down at me, jagged teeth protruding from its mouth. Its gnarled hands grabbed my shoulders, claws digging into my skin. Its breath reeked as it opened its maw wide, as though to swallow me whole. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the trail in darkness. Whatever it was gone. Scrambling to my feet, I gathered my things and fled down the mountain. Twigs snapped behind me, driving me forward. My only thought was reaching my car. When I finally burst into the parking lot, I didn't stop. I threw my gear into the car, locked the doors, and sped off. Even as I drove, I swore I could hear distant screams echoing through the forest. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I haven't been back to the Green Mountains since. This story happened when I was in my late teens, so it was more than a decade ago. I grew up in the northern woods, spending most of my youth outdoors, hiking, camping, or just exploring. For 2 summers in a row, I worked with a volunteer group that cleaned up trash from rural roads and trails. Occasionally, park officials would request we clean areas where illegal dumping had occurred. On the day in question, our group split up to tackle different sections. We used basic GPS devices, but their accuracy was hit or miss back then. I didn't mind, though. I had dreams of becoming a park ranger and felt comfortable navigating remote areas. Others were more hesitant and stayed near the main roads, so I was assigned a more isolated stretch of forest road. Armed with trash bags and a grabber stick, I was dropped off near a well-known illegal dumping spot. People would leave old furniture, sofas, chairs, even mattresses. Luckily, someone with a truck had already removed the larger items, leaving behind smaller debris like bottles, cans, and papers. Occasionally, though, we'd come across far worse things. That day, I found something particularly upsetting. A litter of puppies. They hadn't survived. Without a radio to call for help, I decided to handle it myself. I didn't want to leave them among the garbage. Setting my supplies down by the road, I walked into the forest with the bag containing the pups, determined to bury them. I trekked about 20 minutes until I found a tall, evergreen tree that seemed like a fitting resting spot. Using a sturdy branch I broke and sharpened with my pocket knife, I started digging. The soil was tangled with roots, making the process slow. When I finally finished, I laid the poor puppies to rest, leaving the bag behind to avoid adding to the litter. I covered the grave with dirt and placed pine cones and a smooth stone on top. As I was finishing, I heard a branch snap about 50 feet to my left. I froze, crouched under the tree, and listened. The forest still buzzed with bird calls, though they seemed farther away now. After a few tense minutes of silence and scanning the trees, I saw nothing and resumed my work. But as I turned to leave, a deep, guttural sound, like a mix of a moan and a growl, echoed nearby. This was bear territory with the occasional cougar sighting, so I assumed a predator had caught the scent of the burial. Armed only with a pocket knife, I tried not to panic, convincing myself it could be the sound of trees creaking in the wind. Then I saw it. A chunk of bark fell from a smaller tree about 30 yards away. My eyes followed it upward, and halfway up the trunk, I spotted something. Its color blended into the tree brown, gray, and green. It was roughly the size of a small bear cub, but its shape was unlike any animal I'd seen. I stepped back instinctively, cursing under my breath. The figure clung to the tree, motionless at first, but then it shifted. It wasn't fur-covered like a bear or cougar. Its surface resembled moss or lichen. I couldn't discern a clear face until it turned toward me. Its features were distorted, flattened, with no visible eyes, just dark hollows. It had 4 limbs wrapped around the trunk, each ending in raccoon-like hands with unnaturally long claws. A rat-like tail, as long as its body, swayed behind it. I stood frozen, 80 feet away, struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Suddenly, it moved. It climbed down the tree with a slow, deliberate motion, its claws scraping against the bark. When it stopped on a branch about 12 feet off the ground, I got a better look. Its rounded head lacked a snout, and its skin, or whatever covered it, looked like it could camouflage perfectly with the forest. The thing let out a low, eerie whistle. That was my breaking point. I turned and ran, glancing back occasionally to make sure it wasn't following. Thankfully, it didn't. I reported the incident to the park official supervising us that day. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably a mangy raccoon or some other sick animal. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't like any raccoon or any creature I've ever encountered. To this day, I wonder what was in those woods with me. My name is Emily, and I live in Boone, North Carolina with my dog, Scout. Scout is my best companion. He's an Alaskan Klee-Kai mix, mostly black with streaks of white fur on his legs and face, and little dark rings around his icy blue eyes that make him look like a mischievous bandit. I adopted him from a shelter when he was just a pup, right after my fiancée left for Singapore to pursue a career opportunity. Scout was my anchor during those lonely nights when crawling into an empty bed felt unbearable. Later, when my fiancé decided to settle down with someone he met overseas, Scout was there to comfort me through the heartbreak. Scout is a high-energy dog, what you might call a natural trailblazer. While other dogs are content with casual walks, Scout thrives on long, rugged hikes. For years, I've been taking him every weekend to Pisgah National Forest, one of the few places he can run free. Dogs aren't made for being cooped up inside. They need to roam, explore, and breathe in the wild. And honestly, so do I. Pisgah became my retreat, a sanctuary from the grind of a demanding corporate job. But everything changed one crisp November day when I learned the hard way why people build walls and live in cities. The wilderness, as beautiful as it is, isn't always our ally. Scout loved the forest. For such a regal-looking dog, he had an endearing knack for being goofy. The woods brought out his playful side, his wide blue eyes sparkling as he dashed around with uncontainable energy. His exuberance never failed to make me laugh. That's why it was so jarring when I noticed a sudden change in his demeanor. My lively, fearless dog transformed into a trembling, whimpering shadow, never straying more than a few steps from me. His entire body quivered under my hand when I stroked his neck, and I could feel the fear radiating from him. My first thought was a predator, maybe a cougar, but I'd seen Scout react to predators before. He'd bark furiously and become aggressively protective. This time, he was silent and terrified. It crossed my mind that a bear might be nearby. There had been warnings about increased black bear activity in the area, but Scout wasn't just cautious, he was petrified. Whatever he sensed, it unnerved him in a way I'd never seen before. Scout made it clear he wanted to leave, and honestly, so did I. But we were deep in the forest, at least 2 hours from the trailhead. The hike back would be long, and the sense of unease grew heavier with each step. Scout kept glancing over his shoulder, his ears twitching at every sound, before darting ahead and circling back to me. I couldn't see or hear anything, but I could feel it. A weighty presence, unseen yet oppressive. Something was following us, and Scout knew it. The breaking point came when Scout froze in his tracks, his ears pinned back as he stared into the dense underbrush. His body was rigid, his nose twitching furiously. Then, with a deafening yelp, he bolted ahead, barking wildly. That's when I heard it. A low rustling behind me, followed by a deep, guttural breath. Sounded massive. My heart seized and pure instinct took over. I ran. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I tore through the forest, following Scout's frantic barks. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the primal fear driving me forward was overwhelming. I stumbled, crashing hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't move. Then Scout was there, barking ferociously at whatever loomed behind us. His courage gave me strength. I scrambled to my feet, clutching his collar as we fled together. Scout's barking guided me through the chaos, even when he was out of sight. But my fear spiked again when I burst through a dense thicket and saw him standing at the edge of a river. Scout hated water. He'd avoid it at all costs, no matter how shallow or calm. Now, faced with the rushing stream, he froze. "Come on, Scout. You can do it," I pleaded, my voice shaking with desperation. But he only paced along the bank, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Behind us, the rustling grew louder, closer. My heart broke as I watched Scout retreat into the woods, seemingly unable to overcome his terror. Then, like a miracle, he reappeared, sprinting toward the river at full speed. With an enormous leap, he launched himself across, landing clumsily but safely on the other side. I grabbed his collar, pulling him up the muddy embankment as we continued our desperate escape. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Good boy, Scout. You're so brave." The chase felt endless. My legs burned, my chest ached, and every breath was a struggle. Finally, I collapsed near the edge of a clearing, my vision swimming as my body gave out. When I opened my eyes, I was in the back seat of a pickup truck. A hunter stood outside, offering me water and assuring me that Scout was safe inside their lodge. Relief overwhelmed me, and I sobbed as they explained how Scout had refused to leave my side, barking and whining until they found me. Later, as I sat in their lodge, I recounted what had happened. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances but offered no explanation for what could have been chasing us. I pressed them for answers, but they evaded the question. I've since researched what might inhabit those woods, but I've found no definitive answers. The only thing I know is that something dangerous lurks in those forests, and whatever it is, it's not a bear. Scout is lying by my side as I write this, ever loyal, ever watchful. I often wonder how I'll cope without him someday. But for now, I'm just grateful he was there when I needed him most. This is a plea. Please, I beg you, do not venture into the forests near Briarwood, Vermont. I've known those woods my whole life. I used to play there with my younger cousin when I was as young as 6. Believe me when I say something strange has started happening there. Something bad. It all began during a hike a few weeks ago in early April. Every spring, flocks of birds return from the southern regions to their summer nesting grounds. In these woods, countless birds would fill the trees, chirping their melodies, a natural declaration of territory. But this time, as I wandered beneath the bare branches scattered with last autumn's leaves, there wasn't a sound. No birds, no rustling, no other creatures stirring. This silence alarmed me for two reasons. First, animals often sense danger long before humans do. Their sharper instincts, be it smell, sound, or intuition, can pick up on threats we can't detect. If they had fled or refused to return, it could mean something very wrong was unfolding. Second, woods go unnervingly quiet when a predator is nearby. Birds freeze, hoping that whatever is stalking the area will pass them by unnoticed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Feeling uneasy, I decided to cut my hike short and head back to my car. But then, something very strange happened. Despite my years of familiarity with these woods, I realized I was completely lost. The realization struck when I felt a dull ache throb through my head. I stopped for a moment, rubbing my temples, hoping the headache would ease. But when I looked around, an unfamiliar landscape stared back at me. It was disorienting, like being in a place I'd known forever but that now felt alien. Confused, I pulled out my compass to regain my bearings, only to find the needle behaving erratically. It wouldn't hold steady, drifting around as if unsure where north was. Though unnerving, I knew ways to navigate without a compass. For example, moss typically grows on the side of trees that receives the most sunlight, usually the south. However, when I inspected the tree trunks, I found moss growing on the southern sides, while the sun appeared to hang in the northern sky. This didn't make any sense, and the more I tried to rationalize it, the more panicked I became. But panic, I reminded myself, was dangerous. I calmed myself, resolved to keep walking toward what I thought was the direction of the nearest road. That's when I stumbled upon something I had never seen in all my years exploring those woods. An old, crumbling cabin. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched since the late 1970s. I couldn't understand how I had never seen it before. My cousin and I had explored every corner of those woods as kids. Yet here it was, standing like a forgotten relic. The logical thing to do was approach and knock, hoping someone inside might help me find my way. But as I moved closer, an odd sensation overcame me. A growing heaviness, like the air itself was pushing me back. Each step felt harder than the last, as if something unseen was trying to repel me. Finally, I reached the door and knocked. It creaked open slightly, revealing an interior as decrepit as the exterior. The door's locks had long rusted away, and the furniture inside was arranged in a way that suggested occasional visitors, though it was evident the cabin had been abandoned for years. Something in the far corner caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a collection of debris, but as I approached, I realized it was a wooden figurine perched on a stone pedestal. What I saw is almost impossible to describe. The idol, a tangled mass of wood, vines, and moss, radiated an aura of pure dread. My mind struggled to make sense of it, as if my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. A crushing anxiety gripped me, my headache returning with a vengeance. Somehow, I just knew deep in my soul that the figurine represented something evil, something beyond comprehension. I fled from the cabin without a second thought, sprinting into the forest like a frightened child. And here's where it gets even stranger. When I entered that cabin, it had been daylight. I couldn't have been inside for more than a few minutes. Yet, when I burst out the door, the woods were shrouded in darkness. Night had fallen, and I had no idea how or when. I ran until I found the highway. I ran until I reached my car. I drove home without stopping, desperate to leave that place behind. Since that day, I haven't been able to talk about what happened until now. I tried once with a friend who's an experienced hunter, but the words failed me. All I can say is this: stay away from the woods near Briarwood, Vermont. Every summer for the last few years, a group of friends and I have left our homes in Manchester, England, to visit the remote forests of Caithness in northern Scotland. Caithness is home to one of the most expansive forested areas in the UK, Strathclyde Woods. It's as untouched as nature gets here, with some sections so thick and overgrown that it seems no one has walked there in centuries, maybe even longer. These trips have always brought us a sense of peace, perspective, and a deep respect for the wilderness. But last summer's trip ended in one of the most terrifying and unforgettable experiences of my life, completely altering how I view both the world and the human mind. Each year, we take an overnight train across the border, followed by a hike to a place called Loch Ander. It's a private fishing lake, technically reserved for members of a local angling club. The waters there are stocked with fish, making it an easy spot for us to catch our dinner during a quick, stealthy visit. Honestly, 40 minutes tops, and we'd have plenty of fish, lightning fast by any fisherman's standards. But last year, we decided to try somewhere new, somewhere more adventurous. While poring over a map, we spotted another lake, Loch Garryan, about 25 miles east. It seemed like an ideal alternative, a quieter, more remote fishing spot. And it was. While the catches weren't as quick or plentiful as at Loch Ander, it came with less guilt. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until our second night there. That's when something happened that none of us will ever forget. We were sitting around a campfire, sharing drinks and stories when one of my friends suddenly jumped up and recoiled, staring past the fire. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. His tone wasn't alarmed yet, just cautious. "Who's who?" someone replied lazily. "Someone's moving through the trees back there," he said, pointing toward the forest behind me. I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook us, but his expression quickly told me he wasn't joking. A wave of unease hit me, and I jumped up, spinning around with my flashlight in hand. The tension in our group was palpable as we scanned the trees, our beams darting across trunks and thickets. There was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. "Hello?" someone called out nervously, only to be hushed by the rest of us. We didn't want to give away our position, but at the same time, we needed to know if someone was out there watching us. Silence answered us. "Mate, you've had too much to drink," I said, trying to calm him down. "I haven't even touched my flask," he shot back. "I swear I saw someone. Big, like, really big. Only big thing here is your imagination," another friend joked. "Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." He reluctantly dropped it, but none of us slept well that night. Even after such a long journey, the thought of someone or something stalking us kept us all on edge. The next morning, we dragged ourselves to the lake with our fishing gear. Loch Garryan was stunning, surrounded by hills and blanketed in mist. Normally, we'd appreciate such a serene setting, but the mood among us was dampened, not just by the gray, drizzly weather, but by the memory of the previous night's scare. Midway through fishing, the same friend suddenly shouted, "Look, over there." He was pointing across the lake. "Did you see that?" "What?" I asked, alarmed. "Something came out of the trees over there, then disappeared. Tell me you saw it." We didn't. None of us had seen anything. He grabbed his gear and bolted back to camp, one of the others following to calm him down. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever he thought he'd seen, it was enough to scare him senseless. We were supposed to stay a full week, but that second night was our last. Despite convincing him to stay one more night, things escalated. Around midnight, he burst out of his tent, waking us all. "Do you hear that?" he whispered frantically. We strained to listen, but the forest was eerily silent. There wasn't a sound, no wind, no animals. "Nothing," I said. "There's nothing to hear." But he was scratching at his ears, rocking back and forth, gritting his teeth as if trying to block out some unbearable noise. It dawned on me then, whatever he was hearing wasn't real. It was all in his head. Hey Reddit, I'm Sophia, and I live in the lush Pacific Northwest, specifically in the beautiful state of Oregon. One of my goals for 2021 was to shed the extra pounds I'd gained during my first pregnancy. That weight had knocked my confidence and left me feeling out of shape. My husband always reassured me that he loved me as I was, but I wanted to feel good about myself again. It may sound old-fashioned, but I like to look my best for him, just like he always makes an effort for me. The trouble was, I'd never liked the atmosphere in mixed-gender gyms. Some places seemed more about socializing and less about working out, and the women-only gyms near me were small and poorly equipped. So I decided to try hiking. I thought being out in nature would be great for my mental health too, and it had already helped me deal with postpartum depression. I still remember how thrilled I was when I went to an outdoor store to pick up sturdy hiking boots and some colorful waterproof gear. Mostly in lavender, my favorite shade. Felt like the start of something exciting. I even joined a hiking forum online to get advice on lightweight gear and couldn't wait to share updates on my progress. But my first serious solo hike didn't go as planned. It was far from the calming, uplifting experience I'd hoped for. It turned into a lesson on how unpredictable and dangerous nature can be. My husband agreed to watch our baby so I could drive to Cascade National Forest for an afternoon hike. The first hour went wonderfully. I pushed myself uphill, feeling my muscles burn, and then relished the relief of descending slopes. Felt amazing, invigorating and freeing. That was until I tripped. I must have caught my boot on a hidden root or rock because the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, clutching my ankle in pain. I could still put a bit of weight on it, so I figured it wasn't broken, but it hurt a lot. Then, something surprising happened. A crow, a sleek, black-feathered bird, flew down from a tree and landed on a branch nearby. It flapped its wings and made a racket, cawing loudly as if it were trying to check on me. It seemed so curious and almost concerned. I laughed nervously and told it, "I'm fine," just startled myself. And it quieted down, tilting its head to look at me with those shiny, dark eyes. Even though my ankle was sore, I got up, said goodbye to my new feathered companion, and started limping back toward my car. But to my surprise, the little crow followed me. It flitted from tree to tree, cawing occasionally as if to keep me company. I was touched. It felt like nature's way of offering comfort when I needed it most. Unfortunately, my ankle began to swell, and the pain intensified with each step. As I sat on a fallen log to rest, the throbbing pain brought back memories of labor. Overwhelmed, I started crying. Just then, the crow swooped down and started cawing and flapping again, as if trying to cheer me up. It was such a sweet moment, like something out of a fairy tale. A crying woman and her loyal bird friend. But the magical moment shattered when I heard something in the woods above me. A rustling sound. Something big was moving through the trees. Then I saw it. A massive bear, fresh out of hibernation, staring straight at me. The crow suddenly became frantic, cawing louder than ever and flapping wildly. At first, I thought it was warning me. I quickly realized I was wrong. The bear started charging downhill, its eyes locked on me. Thankfully, I'd taken advice from my hiking group and bought the strongest bear spray I could find. Heart racing, I grabbed it, flicked off the safety, and sprayed a thick cloud of yellow mist into the air. The bear ran straight into it, stopped abruptly, and began sneezing and coughing violently. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I forced myself to run, ignoring the pain in my ankle, until I finally reached my car. Somehow, I made it home. Later, when I calmed down, I did some research on crows. What I'd thought was a sweet, Disney-like friendship wasn't that at all. Crows are known to alert predators, like bears, to injured animals. After the predator eats, the crow scavenges the remains. That day, I realized I was lucky to have escaped being part of nature's food chain. Mount Fuji, one of Asia's tallest volcanoes, is revered as a sacred symbol in Japan and a cultural treasure. On clear days, the mountain's perfectly symmetrical, snow-covered peak is visible from the bustling capital of Tokyo, providing a serene contrast to city life. Frequently depicted in art and postcards, Mount Fuji is a globally recognized icon of Japanese beauty. Nestled on the northwestern side of Mount Fuji lies a 230 square kilometer forest atop hardened lava, called Aokigahara. Known as the Sea of Trees, this dense woodland absorbs sound due to its porous volcanic rock, offering visitors an eerie sense of silence. This natural phenomenon, paired with the forest's reputation, draws both nature enthusiasts and those with darker intentions. Aokigahara is infamous in Japanese folklore as a place haunted by eerie, or restless spirits. Over the years, it has tragically become a well-known site for people seeking to end their lives. To deter such actions, authorities have placed signs at key trails urging individuals to reconsider and offering contact information for helplines. Despite these measures, incidents persist. In 2003 alone, over 100 bodies were discovered in the forest, up from 78 the previous year. By 2010, police reported that over 200 people had attempted to end their lives there, with around 50 succeeding. Most cases involve methods like overdoses or hanging, though other means have been observed. This grim pattern often spikes in March, coinciding with the end of Japan's fiscal year, highlighting the societal pressures many face. Efforts to reduce the forest's grim reputation include suppressing statistics to discourage its use for such acts. Aokigahara's tragic allure has been linked, in part, to popular literature. A novel titled Nami no To, *The Tower of Waves*, published in 1961 by Saicho Matsumoto, tells the story of a couple who enter the forest to end their lives together. Though considered one of Japan's most romantic tales, its association with the site has contributed to its reputation. Another controversial book, The Complete Manual of Suicide by Wataru Tsurumi, published in 1993, provides explicit instructions on methods of self-harm. Despite the author's claim that the book aims to make society more empathetic, its detailed approach stirred outrage, selling over 1 million copies and cementing its infamy. The forest's association with death, however, predates these works. A historical practice in Japan called abasut, which translates to abandoning the elderly, involved leaving infirm relatives in remote areas to die. Though largely abandoned by the 19th century, this custom has contributed to the belief that Aokigahara is haunted by spirits of those left to perish. In recent years, the forest gained international attention due to a widely criticized incident involving an American YouTuber, Logan Paul. During a trip to Japan, he filmed a video in Aokigahara, where he and his team encountered the body of a deceased individual. The video, which featured inappropriate jokes and reactions, sparked global outrage. Though the face of the deceased was blurred, the footage was deemed disrespectful. As a result, Paul's YouTube partnerships and projects were suspended, and the incident reignited discussions about mental health and cultural sensitivity. Japan continues to grapple with high suicide rates, with over 25,000 people taking their lives annually, or about 70 per day, most of whom are men. Notable cases, such as a 71-year-old man who set himself on fire aboard a train in 2014, highlight the societal struggles many face. These tragedies raise profound questions about the pressures of life, the value of mental health support, and the human condition itself. Even amidst Aokigahara's dark history, glimmers of hope exist. Ribbons tied to trees guide those who may reconsider their decisions back to safety, symbolizing a chance for redemption and connection in an otherwise silent and haunting place. The most chilling story I've ever heard came from my great-uncle. He was a soldier during World War II and enlisted the day he turned 19, on February 15, 1945. His timing meant he avoided both the D-Day landings and the immediate aftermath, but he found himself thrust into an even grimmer chapter of the conflict, the Allied invasion of Germany itself. With hindsight, it seems inevitable that Germany would lose the war, crushed by the combined might of the Allied and Soviet forces. But in the thick of the fighting, there was no certainty. On the battlefield in the dense forests and fields of Central Europe, Germany clung to the belief it could still prevail, relying on advanced weaponry, tactical resistance, or sheer willpower. This was the grim phase my great-uncle was drawn into, a campaign that was as horrifying as anything that had come before. The ordeal began during the Battle of Cologne on September 27, 1945. Cologne had become part of Germany's main defensive line, and the Allies wanted to capture it swiftly to open the path to the heavily industrialized Ruhr region. Just south of the city was a foreboding place called the Schwarzwald, or Black Forest, where tens of thousands of German troops were entrenched. The mission of my great-uncle's unit was to patrol the woods, locate enemy positions, and direct artillery or airstrikes against them. The morning was quiet at first, but chaos erupted when a single rifle shot dropped one of their men to the ground. The soldiers scrambled for cover as more shots echoed through the trees. It took several frantic minutes before they could even determine the direction of the attack. In that time, several others were struck down by the unseen marksman. Attempts to retreat were futile. The sniper methodically targeted anyone who tried to flee. Within moments, the entire unit was trapped, pinned down by a single German sharpshooter. As awful as that was, my great-uncle said the worst part came later. The radio operator, who had been one of the first to fall, lay lifeless in a small clearing. Each time a soldier tried to retrieve the radio to call for reinforcements, the sniper fired, forcing them back. One brave man managed to grab hold of the equipment, but the sniper shot him through the hand, severing tendons and rendering it useless. Without a working radio, the platoon was stranded, completely at the mercy of one man with a rifle. For hours, they stayed motionless, afraid to so much as twitch. Occasionally, someone would shift slightly or peek out to spot the sniper, only to be immediately shot. And every time the sniper fired, he laughed. A loud, mocking laugh that echoed eerily through the forest. Sometimes, he shouted something in German, which my great-uncle later learned translated roughly to, "Cry for your mothers, little boys." The sniper toyed with them for 6 excruciating hours. At one point, when he could no longer find active targets, he started shooting at the bodies of the dead. My great-uncle watched in horror as the man beside him, who had died slumped against a tree, was shot again and again. The first shot fractured the man's skull, but the sniper kept firing, turning his head into an unrecognizable mess of bone and blood. My great-uncle said that of all the gruesome injuries he saw during the war, head wounds were the most unsettling. A person's face changes so completely when the skull is shattered. The man who had been his comrade moments earlier was now someone or something he couldn't recognize. As night fell, the platoon finally made their escape. The sniper, undeterred, shouted insults after them, calling them cowards as his laughter echoed through the trees. My great-uncle remembered running as fast as he could, stumbling over roots and branches in the darkness. One soldier ran headfirst into a tree, breaking his nose, but didn't stop. My great-uncle passed away last year, and I wanted to share this story as a tribute to the courage and resilience he showed in a time of unimaginable hardship. Rest in peace. This is a true account, and every time I share it, it captures everyone's attention. Back in the summer of 2018, my friends Jake and Emily and I decided to escape to the mountains. The cabin fever from being cooped up for so long had hit us hard, and we were desperate for a change of scenery. We settled on a trip to a remote state, planning to hike and camp at several locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to stay in a secluded cabin deep in the woods. Jake's parents had once rented a fire lookout tower and loved it, but all we could find was a cabin near one. It was cheap, clean, and far from anyone else, so we booked it, excited to have a carefree night. Leading up to the trip, we thought it might be fun to take mushrooms while at the cabin. Emily brought a stash with her, safely tucked in her bag as we left the driveway to start our journey. On the way, though, I felt a deep unease, a knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. I told Jake and Emily that there was no way we should take anything that night. Emily was furious, and we got into a heated argument. Despite her frustration, I stood firm. Something in my gut told me we had no business messing around that night. Finally, the tension eased, and we continued our drive. The cabin was about a 25-minute drive from the nearest small town, perched atop a rugged hill. The road leading to it was narrow and winding, with no pull-offs or other campsites along the way. When we arrived, the place was as advertised, small, quiet, and surrounded by thick trees. We settled in, started a fire outside, and watched as dusk turned to night. Then we heard the distant hum of an engine. Soon, a pair of headlights came into view. A small utility vehicle with a few teens inside rolled up. They waved at us with friendly smiles before climbing up the fire tower nearby. Relieved that they were harmless visitors, we went back to relaxing. We had been warned that people occasionally stopped by to visit the fire tower, and they were the only ones we saw. After they left, we put out the fire, moved inside, and prepared some quick snacks. We cooked hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate quickly, and sat in silence. You don't realize how deafening quiet can be until you're in the middle of nowhere. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, every gust of wind, it all feels amplified. In the city, there's always some background noise to fill the silence. Here, the closest thing to that was our own breathing. We jumped at every little noise, too nervous to talk much. Finally, I broke the tension by cracking open a few wine coolers, passing them around, and pulling out a board game. Slowly, we started to loosen up and laugh, managing to have some fun despite the eerie quiet. Later, we'd recall faint noises in the background, like the snap of a twig or the distant rumble of an engine. But none of us wanted to break the fragile sense of normalcy we'd built, so we ignored them. That is, until a hand suddenly smacked the window, 3 loud, deliberate slaps. We screamed, panicked, and Jake immediately called 911. He put the call on speakerphone and handed the phone to me while grabbing the fire poker and passing another to Emily. Emily, in tears, began calling family members to say what she feared were her final goodbyes. I strained to listen for any further sounds. Whoever or whatever it was had surely heard us call for help. The silence that followed was almost worse, making every second feel stretched and unbearable. 20 minutes later, law enforcement arrived, a surprisingly quick response for such a remote area in the middle of the night. They brought dogs to search the area but found no trace of anyone. They suggested it might have been a bear, but we could tell they weren't convinced, and neither were we. A bear wouldn't slap a window. It would go straight for the food we had cooked. And why would a bear retreat so quietly after hearing us scream? Before they left, the officers mentioned seeing a car parked at the base of the hill on their way up. That was the only sign of life they encountered. My blood ran cold. Jake and Emily, still shaken, didn't seem to grasp the full weight of what that meant. But when we stepped outside to pack up, a new horror greeted us. Emily's car, covered in handprints, prints in the dust on places we hadn't touched. made by hands that weren't ours. We grabbed our belongings as quickly as we could, threw everything into the car, and followed the officers down the hill. Every bump and pothole on the road felt like a blessing, putting more distance between us and that cabin. None of us could sleep that night. I kept thinking about that car we'd seen. There was nothing else on that hill, no other campsites, no turnoffs. The fire tower might have drawn a visitor, but whoever came up that night didn't drive all the way. They stopped, got out, and hiked silently the rest of the way to stay unnoticed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment prank. It was calculated. They wanted silence. They wanted secrecy. I'll never know what that person wanted or how the night might have ended if Jake hadn't called for help. Maybe it was a sick joke, or maybe it was the start of something far worse. All I know is that I'm grateful we made it out, and I hope to never find out what could have happened. During one summer, my friend Mia invited me and her cousin Jack to her family's cabin by a lake in Oregon. It was a cozy retreat, and we spent a few wonderful days enjoying the outdoors. On our final evening, as we had the previous nights, we went fishing at the nearby lake, just a 5-minute walk from the cabin. It was around 7 p.m., the perfect time to catch fish. To get to the lake, we had to pass through a small patch of woods with a narrow trail. During the day, the trail was lively with joggers and families heading to another popular beach nearby. However, the lake we preferred was more secluded and required descending a steep, slippery hill. Climbing back up afterward was a challenge, often needing us to crawl on all fours. That evening, we stayed at the lakeside until about 8:30 p.m., chatting quietly while darkness gradually enveloped the area. We were generally well-behaved kids, content to sit on a log and talk. At some point, we realized how late it had gotten. I suggested to Mia and Jack that we should head back. They agreed, and we began gathering our fishing gear. This was the latest we'd ever stayed out, and my imagination, fueled by too many scary movies, was beginning to run wild. We started climbing the hill in silence. I mentioned how eerie the woods felt at night, and Jack made things worse by telling us a chilling tale about a group of reclusive mountain dwellers from the 1960s. According to him, they were part of a sinister cult and had been responsible for numerous murders in the area. He even suggested that some of them might still be out there. Though I laughed it off outwardly and told him to stop, his story unsettled me. As we crossed the trail, Jack suddenly froze and stared to our right. He looked genuinely frightened. Mia dismissed his reaction as a prank and began climbing the steepest part of the hill. But then Jack grabbed both of us by the arms and urged us to look. At first, I saw nothing and was impatient to leave, but then my eyes adjusted to the dim light. That's when I noticed a large figure, a man, judging by his silhouette, slowly staggering toward us. We didn't wait to find out his intentions. Terrified, we scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. At one point, I glanced back and saw the man moving faster, though his steps were clumsy. He got uncomfortably close before we finally crested the hill and bolted across the road to the cabin. When we reached the porch, we dumped our gear and ran to the front door, only to find it locked. Mia and Jack frantically knocked in the family's secret rhythm, a specific pattern they used to identify friends or relatives. I anxiously scanned the woods but saw no sign of the man. Finally, we were let inside, where we breathlessly recounted our encounter to the adults. They tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just some random guy who hadn't meant any harm, but we weren't convinced. Still, we felt safer in the cabin with the grown-ups. Later that night, Mia and I went to the lower level of the cabin, where our bunk beds were, to change into pajamas. The lower level wasn't a creepy basement, but more like a separate floor with windows and a door. As we were calming down, we suddenly heard the family knock. Thinking it was Jack at the door, I called out for him to come in, but there was no response. The knock came again, this time more deliberate. That's when we realized it was coming from the window. Mia and I froze, our stomachs twisting with fear. The knock came once more frantic this time. Without hesitating, we ran upstairs to the living room, where the rest of the family was gathered. Through tears, we explained what we'd heard. Jack went down to listen and confirmed it was the same distinctive knock. Mia's uncle and a few older family members grabbed flashlights and prepared to check outside. As they did, the knocking started again, this time on the front door. We all stared in fear as it happened once or twice more before Mia's uncle decided to call the police. He reported that someone was attempting to get into the cabin and described the situation. The knocking stopped shortly after. Within minutes, the police arrived, their loud knocks and calls adding a strange sense of relief. Mia's uncle explained everything, and we told the officers about the man in the woods. Though they searched the area thoroughly, they found no one. The officers suggested it was likely someone trying to scare us, but what haunted me most was how the person had managed to mimic the family's unique knock so perfectly. None of us slept alone that night. We huddled together on the floor, still shaken by the experience. During one summer, my friend Mia invited me and her cousin Jack to her family's cabin by a lake in Oregon. It was a cozy retreat, and we spent a few wonderful days enjoying the outdoors. On our final evening, as we had the previous nights, we went fishing at the nearby lake, just a 5-minute walk from the cabin. It was around 7 p.m., the perfect time to catch fish. To get to the lake, we had to pass through a small patch of woods with a narrow trail. During the day, the trail was lively with joggers and families heading to another popular beach nearby. However, the lake we preferred was more secluded and required descending a steep, slippery hill. Climbing back up afterward was a challenge, often needing us to crawl on all fours. That evening, we stayed at the lakeside until about 8:30 p.m., chatting quietly while darkness gradually enveloped the area. We were generally well-behaved kids, content to sit on a log and talk. At some point, we realized how late it had gotten. I suggested to Mia and Jack that we should head back. They agreed, and we began gathering our fishing gear. This was the latest we'd ever stayed out, and my imagination, fueled by too many scary movies, was beginning to run wild. We started climbing the hill in silence. I mentioned how eerie the woods felt at night, and Jack made things worse by telling us a chilling tale about a group of reclusive mountain dwellers from the 1960s. According to him, they were part of a sinister cult and had been responsible for numerous murders in the area. He even suggested that some of them might still be out there. Though I laughed it off outwardly and told him to stop, his story unsettled me. As we crossed the trail, Jack suddenly froze and stared to our right. He looked genuinely frightened. Mia dismissed his reaction as a prank and began climbing the steepest part of the hill. But then Jack grabbed both of us by the arms and urged us to look. At first, I saw nothing and was impatient to leave, but then my eyes adjusted to the dim light. That's when I noticed a large figure, a man, judging by his silhouette, slowly staggering toward us. We didn't wait to find out his intentions. Terrified, we scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. At one point, I glanced back and saw the man moving faster, though his steps were clumsy. He got uncomfortably close before we finally crested the hill and bolted across the road to the cabin. When we reached the porch, we dumped our gear and ran to the front door, only to find it locked. Mia and Jack frantically knocked in the family's secret rhythm, a specific pattern they used to identify friends or relatives. I anxiously scanned the woods but saw no sign of the man. Finally, we were let inside, where we breathlessly recounted our encounter to the adults. They tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just some random guy who hadn't meant any harm, but we weren't convinced. Still, we felt safer in the cabin with the grown-ups. Later that night, Mia and I went to the lower level of the cabin, where our bunk beds were, to change into pajamas. The lower level wasn't a creepy basement, but more like a separate floor with windows and a door. As we were calming down, we suddenly heard the family knock. Thinking it was Jack at the door, I called out for him to come in, but there was no response. The knock came again, this time more deliberate. That's when we realized it was coming from the window. Mia and I froze, our stomachs twisting with fear. The knock came once more frantic this time. Without hesitating, we ran upstairs to the living room, where the rest of the family was gathered. Through tears, we explained what we'd heard. Jack went down to listen and confirmed it was the same distinctive knock. Mia's uncle and a few older family members grabbed flashlights and prepared to check outside. As they did, the knocking started again, this time on the front door. We all stared in fear as it happened once or twice more before Mia's uncle decided to call the police. He reported that someone was attempting to get into the cabin and described the situation. The knocking stopped shortly after. Within minutes, the police arrived, their loud knocks and calls adding a strange sense of relief. Mia's uncle explained everything, and we told the officers about the man in the woods. Though they searched the area thoroughly, they found no one. The officers suggested it was likely someone trying to scare us, but what haunted me most was how the person had managed to mimic the family's unique knock so perfectly. None of us slept alone that night. We huddled together on the floor, still shaken by the experience. My friend Lisa invited me to join her at a gathering. This event was being hosted by her old friend, Amy. Lisa and Amy had attended a private school together during their elementary and middle school years, but they went to different high schools later on. Lisa switched to a public high school where she met me while Amy stayed in private school. Over time, they had drifted apart and developed separate social circles, which is why Lisa wanted me to come along. It was Amy's birthday, and her parents had rented a cabin for her celebration. They had done the same the previous year, unaware that she had used the space to throw a party. Since the last one was a hit, Amy planned to do it again. Lisa and I drove to the cabin together, and it was pretty remote. Aside from the forest surrounding it, there wasn't much nearby. We couldn't even see other cabins, and given that it was winter, they were probably empty anyway. Initially, I felt nervous because I wouldn't know anyone at the party, but I figured a couple of drinks would ease my discomfort. Plus, having a party in a cabin deep in the woods, it sounded straight out of a horror movie cliché. Lisa and I even joked on the way there that this felt like the start of a scary film. Adding to the strange vibe, this was a private school crowd, which made it even more surreal. When we arrived, it was pitch dark outside. We had to use our phones as flashlights to find our way to the cabin. Inside, everything seemed normal at first. Amy was enjoying herself and there was a good turnout. But something felt off, a kind of unspoken divide among the partygoers. Lisa and I didn't know what was going on. I did, however, recognize one guy who had the name of our town tattooed in a rough scrawl across his neck. Lisa and I couldn't help but laugh about it, though we were a bit uneasy, wondering if it meant he was in some gang or something. At some point, the main group at the party decided they wanted another group to leave. Apparently, the other group had been drinking heavily without bringing any alcohol themselves, which annoyed the hosts. To get rid of them, someone spread a story that a park ranger or caretaker was going to stop by, and only a small number of people were supposed to be there. It was rumored that one guy in the group was on probation and couldn't risk trouble, so they left. We thought the plan worked, until one of the girls from the group came back into the cabin. She loudly announced, "I just wanted to wish the birthday girl a happy birthday." Her exaggerated voice drew everyone's attention, and we all stared at her, confused by the awkward display. Not even 2 seconds later, the sound of shattering glass came from one of the back rooms. Windows were being smashed and chaos erupted. People were yelling and panicking. Lisa and I had only been at the party for about 15 minutes when everything descended into madness. The girl who had invited the unruly group then mentioned she knew one of them had a weapon. I don't know if I was in shock or just not processing things correctly, but I sat there thinking, well, this is happening. Most of us stayed inside the cabin, but a few people ventured out to see if the group was still around. After a while, people started leaving. There was still some fear that the troublemakers were lurking outside, but many just wanted to get out of there. I remember 3 girls who had planned to stay overnight grabbing all their belongings and heading for the door. As soon as they stepped outside, we heard loud screaming from the woods. The girls immediately turned back and came inside, their arms still full of their stuff. In hindsight, it was almost comical, but at the time, it wasn't. One of them even started crying. Thankfully, the scream turned out to be from a new guest arriving at the party. She had seen her friend outside and screamed in excitement. Lisa and I stuck around for a couple more hours. We didn't want to leave Amy alone, especially since most of the guests had left by then. Only a handful of people remained, and they were staying the night. Around 2 a.m., we finally decided it was safe enough to head out. We had debated calling the police, but the underage drinking made everyone hesitant. Plus, Amy was worried her parents would find out about the party. She decided to make up a story about how the windows got broken. Thankfully, the rowdy group didn't come back, but the whole night left me shaken. Looking back, the weirdest part wasn't even the chaos. It was that all this happened at a birthday party in a remote cabin in the woods, hosted by someone who went to a private school. When I was 10, something unforgettable happened. My older sister, Maya, was 13, and our younger sister, Lily, was 7. Dad worked as a freelance web designer back then. Although his projects paid well, he was burdened with over $500,000 in debt, and Mom wasn't the best at managing money. This left us with little extra cash, so vacations were rare, usually just visits to relatives. One evening, Dad wrapped up a big job and decided to celebrate with a horror movie. He loved scaring us, so we watched Final Destination. Midway through, the phone rang. Dad answered, spoke briefly, then called Mom into the hallway. While they were gone, Lily paused the movie to cuddle our dog, Max, for comfort. About 10 minutes later, our parents came back, announcing we'd be spending the weekend at a lakeside cabin. Dad's client had offered it to us at a heavily discounted rate. Mom went into a whirlwind of packing since we'd leave the next day, cutting our movie night short. After school on Friday, we loaded into the family van for the 2.5-hour drive. By the time we arrived, it was dark. The cabin was cozy, with a small loft just big enough for us kids to hang out and play board games. We picked our rooms. Mom and Dad took the big one. Maya chose the smaller one with a single bed, and Lily and I shared a room with a queen-sized bed. Our room had a window without curtains on one side, a lamp on the other, and a locked closet we couldn't open. That night, we went to bed around 11. I fell asleep quickly, but not long after. I woke to Lily clutching my arm, whispering frantically. Through the window, I glimpsed a pale, human-like figure retreating into the dark. My half-asleep brain struggled to make sense of it before I bolted upright and grabbed Lily. We ran to our parents, who dismissed it as a bad dream. Reluctantly, we returned to bed, switching spots so Lily wouldn't have to sleep by the window. I read her a story until we both fell asleep. The next day, we explored the lake before heading into town. We browsed shops, had lunch, and didn't return to the cabin until evening. As we approached, Dad suddenly stopped, signaling us to stay quiet. The front door was slightly ajar. Dad stepped in cautiously, checking each room before calling us inside. He seemed unsettled but didn't explain why. Instead, he locked the door and joined us for a board game while Mom cleaned up. By 9 p.m., Dad insisted we go to bed, which upset Maya since she usually stayed up later. Lily and I settled back into our room, with me reading her to sleep again. Hours later, I woke to Dad rushing into our room, scooping up Lily and grabbing my hand. In the hall, I saw Mom doing the same with Maya. Our dog, Max, was growling at the back door. Dad didn't stop until we were all in the van. He went back for Max and sped away without a word. It wasn't until years later that I learned what happened. Dad had woken up to strange sounds outside his window. When he checked, he found the front door unlocked, items in the kitchen moved, and Max growling at the back door, which was ajar. The next day, Dad retrieved our belongings and found footprints outside Lily's and my window. Even now, the memory gives me chills. It all seemed like the perfect escape. Getting away from the city noise, the endless crowds, and the never-ending obligations. Just us, the wilderness, and the warmth of a crackling fire for company. Jared was the one who proposed the Montana backwoods. He claimed to know a remote spot, far from any trail or tourist maps. Sounded ideal, almost too ideal. But in that moment, I only cared about leaving everything behind. The dirt road wound on for miles, a narrow strip cutting through dense woods. The pines stretched so high they seemed to brush the clouds, their branches weaving together to block out the sky. As we drove deeper, the silence grew heavier. No birds, no breeze, just the steady rumble of the car engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. It wasn't the postcard-perfect tranquility I'd envisioned, but something about it pulled me in. Felt like stepping into another world. From the back seat, Zach leaned forward, smirking as he peered out the window. "Think we'll spot Bigfoot out here?" Jared chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. "More like find out how fast we can run if we do," he replied. I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. Maybe it was the realization that our phones lost service an hour ago. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in, pressing against the car like a living wall. Whatever it was, I kept the unease to myself. We arrived at the clearing late in the afternoon, a patch of open ground beside a still lake. The water was so calm it mirrored the treetops perfectly, like a portal to another world. We climbed out, stretched our legs, and got to work. Jared and Zach unpacked the tents while Mia and Rebecca searched for firewood. I wandered to the edge of the clearing, trying to shake off the growing tension in my chest. There wasn't much to see, just endless trees and a few deer tracks leading to the lake. I stood by the water, the quiet settling over me. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, as if unseen eyes were watching. "You okay, Chris?" Rebecca called from behind me, her arms full of sticks. I turned and forced a smile. "Yeah, just soaking it all in." She nodded but kept staring at me a moment too long. That night, we gathered around the fire, its flickering light the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. Jared shared stories, starting with light-hearted ones that made us laugh. Then he shifted to something Mia mentioned earlier, a local legend. "A skin changer," he said, voice low. "A witch that can take the form of animals or even people." He grinned like it was a joke, but his eyes kept darting to the darkened tree line. "Enough, Jared," Mia said, tossing a pine cone into the flames. Her voice had a nervous edge, and she glanced over her shoulder. "Fine, fine. But if you see me wandering out there," Jared said, smirking, "don't follow." We laughed, but it was forced, brittle. I found myself staring at the shadows just beyond the firelight, half expecting something to move. That night in my tent, I lay awake, listening. The wind picked up, causing the trees to groan, but there was something else. Slow, deliberate rustling outside. My heart raced as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing, just the dim glow of the dying campfire. I zipped it back up, feeling foolish, but sleep didn't come easily. By morning, the clearing felt colder, heavier. Jared poked at the fire's embers as I stepped out. "Sleep okay?" he asked, but his eyes betrayed his own unease. "Like a rock," I lied. Rebecca was wandering near the tree line, staring up at the trunks. I joined her, sipping my coffee. "You see these?" she asked, pointing at deep scratches in the bark. They looked fresh, deliberate. "Probably animals," I said, though it didn't add up. We were miles from any trail. "My grandma used to say marks like this were warnings," Rebecca murmured. I brushed it off, but the pit in my stomach deepened. We decided to hike later that morning, though no one strayed far. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Halfway through, Zach stopped abruptly, staring ahead. "What's that?" We followed his gaze and froze. A deer carcass lay half hidden in the brush, its body twisted unnaturally, its ribs exposed. Flies buzzed around it, and the air stank of decay. "Cougar," Jared suggested, though he didn't sound sure. The remains looked arranged, as if placed deliberately. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice tight. That night, the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind, but rhythmic. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered. I nodded, my chest tightening. My name was among the whispers. Jared's flashlight flickered as he stood. For a second, its beam caught something tall and thin in the trees. Then it vanished. We bolted, racing back to the trucks. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking and circling. I felt unseen eyes on my back the whole way. Finally, we reached the vehicles. As we sped away, I caught sight of a figure in the rearview mirror. It stood at the clearing's edge, grinning, its face my own. Hours later, we reached a gas station, our nerves frayed. I stepped out and found a note under the windshield wiper. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't come back." I crumpled the paper and climbed back in the truck. We drove into the night, leaving the woods far behind. But even now, safe at home, I feel it, the weight of those eyes still watching. It seemed like such a perfect plan at the time. Escaping the endless city clamor, the crowds, and the weight of responsibilities. Just us, the woods, and the soothing crackle of a campfire to keep us company. Jake had been the one to propose the Montana wilderness, insisting he knew an isolated spot far from any well-traveled trails. Sounded ideal, maybe too ideal, but I wasn't questioning it then. All I wanted was to leave everything behind. The dirt road stretched endlessly, cutting through dense, towering evergreens that blocked most of the sky. Their branches arched over the road like a canopy, filtering out the fading afternoon sun. The deeper we drove, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, just the hum of the car's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. It wasn't the postcard image of serenity I'd imagined. Instead, it felt otherworldly, like we were crossing into a different realm. Paul, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward and peered out the window. "Think we'll run into a grizzly or something?" he joked with a lopsided grin. Jake smirked, hands steady on the wheel. "More likely to see how fast we can run if we do." His focus stayed fixed on the road. I tried to chuckle, but it came out as a nervous cough. Something felt off. Maybe it was the fact that our phones had lost signal an hour earlier, or maybe it was the way the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing together as if to trap us. Whatever it was, I didn't say anything. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing, a small patch of land beside a tranquil lake. The water was so still it reflected the treetops perfectly, like a mirror showing a world beneath the surface. We climbed out, stretched our legs, and began unpacking. Jake and Paul worked on the tents while Rachel and Claire gathered firewood. I wandered around the clearing's edge, trying to shake off the strange feeling settling in my chest. There wasn't much to see, just more trees and a few deer tracks leading to the lake. I stood there for a while, staring at the water, unsettled by the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes your skin crawl, as though something unseen is watching. "You okay, Mark?" Claire called, arms full of branches. I turned and forced a smile. "Yeah, just soaking it all in." She nodded but lingered, her gaze lingering on me longer than I liked. That night, we sat around the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced against the forest's darkness. Jake regaled us with stories, most of them meant to lighten the mood. Then the conversation shifted to a tale Rachel had mentioned earlier, a legend her grandfather used to tell. A shapeshifter, she called it, a being capable of imitating both humans and animals. Jake took the bait, embellishing it as he went. "Be careful," he teased, eyes glinting in the firelight. "If you see me wandering out there, don't follow." "Jake, enough," Rachel snapped, tossing a twig into the fire. Her laugh was uneasy, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. We all tried to laugh it off, but the mood had changed. As the night deepened, the darkness pressed closer. Shadows gathered just beyond the firelight, and I found myself staring into them, half expecting to see something move. Hashtag the shadowed wilderness. I can't recall the last time I felt this desperate to escape everything. Work had been a whirlwind of stress, and life itself felt stifling. That's why I impulsively decided to load up my belongings and drive to the Duskwood Forest. The name sounds ominous, sure, but I wasn't dwelling on that when I planned the trip. I was craving solitude. The last time I'd been there, I was about 10 years old, tagging along with my family. I faintly remembered the crisp air and the endless canopy of trees. Now, years later, I found myself steering my old, rattling car down the forest's winding dirt path, my supplies bouncing in the trunk. For the first time in ages, I felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe the stillness of nature could relieve the suffocating weight I'd been carrying. By late afternoon, I arrived at a clearing beside a shallow stream, surrounded by gnarled trees with thick, sprawling branches. Sunlight barely broke through the dense foliage, creating a dim but oddly serene atmosphere. I parked my car and got to work setting up my tent. As I worked, a strange feeling lingered, one I couldn't shake off. The woods didn't feel quite like I remembered. Quieter, more secluded. But wasn't that the point? To be alone? The eerie silence was pierced by an unexpected sound. Faint laughter. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. It was the light-hearted giggle of a child playing a game. I froze, gripping the tent pole in my hand. My ears strained to catch another sound, but the forest had gone deathly still. "You're imagining things, Emma?" I muttered to myself, brushing off the unease. Night fell quickly, and I started a campfire, the flickering flames casting long shadows. The fire made me feel secure, like nothing bad could happen within its glow. Yet, an unshakable tension lingered. Occasionally, I'd glance into the woods, convinced I saw movement. Shadows shifting, shapes darting. Just the trees swaying, I told myself. After dinner, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and burrowed into my sleeping bag. The quiet was unnerving. No chirping insects or hooting owls, just the soft whisper of wind through the trees. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep. Then it came again. That laugh, louder this time, closer. My chest tightened as I held my breath, listening. A rustling followed, the sound of something dragging across the forest floor. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light swept through the clearing. Nothing, just the swaying trees. A nervous chuckle escaped me as I stepped outside to reassure myself. As I walked, the light from my flashlight caught something in the leaves. A small, rusty bell. It was old, worn, but oddly polished in places. The sight of it sent chills up my spine. I dropped it and hurried back to the tent, convincing myself it was just trash left by a hiker. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the laughter echoed faintly in my mind.